Hello and welcome back to Podcasts from the Edge with me, Peter Bruce. This is the final offering for the year, and it's a pleasure to get back to the subject that probably most warms my heart, industrial policy and its implementation. To do that, the only person in the country worth talking to is Donald Mackay, Managing Director of XA Global Trade Advisors. He knows literally everything about what we make and how we sell it and where, and what we import and the barriers the state sets up to make those imports as expensive as possible so South African companies can compete with them, at least in our home market. Not for nothing was he asked earlier in the year to join the Trade, Industry and Competition Minister Park Towers Advisory Council. So, Donald, how are we doing and what have you been able to achieve in the Advisory Council? I presume you meet constantly with the Minister.
We do meet constantly, and hello, Peter, but I'm not sure I've really accomplished much at all. So, largely, you go to meetings and then get ignored. That's how it works. Yep. So, what is the state? I think there are a couple of things that show at least some sign of a move in the right direction. But there are others which do concern me. So I think there's political pressure has been brought to bear by having the GNU. And I think some of that is causing a political move to the left in the industrial policy space, which I don't think is a good thing, but it does seem to be at least the shift in that direction. On the other hand, we have a more predictable minister than his predecessor. We have somebody who's not transactional in the way that his predecessor was. And so I think from that perspective, I have some hope. But I think the general direction of travel still leans heavily on the state figuring out what to do.
How does the addition of right of centre parties into the GNU shift industrial policy to the left?
Well, I think there are a few things. The one is I think the DA particularly has created pressure on the ANC, and so my guess on this would be that you either have to shift in that direction, or you need to take a step in the opposite direction to kind of show that you still have your own identity and that you haven't sold out to the capitalist running dogs. So I think there's an element of that is pushing to the left. I also don't, by the way, think that the DA has done much to help themselves by leaving the position of Andrew Whitfield open for such an incredibly long time, at a time when a lot of the policy work was being done. So I think
it really is astonishing. I mean, there's a huge hole there, surely, for the DA that they've not bothered filling. And industrial policy is the very center of whether we become a success in this country or not.
Yeah, look, I have no idea what the DA was thinking there. There was a moment where they thought that portfolio was so important that they themselves wanted to manage the portfolio. But when the vacancy occurred, they appeared to have just done nothing. So I can only guess that perhaps the DA's internal politics are starting to look a little bit like the ANC's internal politics, and Steenhuisen couldn't find a way to take a decision.
Yeah. And just tell me very briefly before we move on, the advisory council, Parks Towers Advisory Council, is it an open thing? Can you speak frankly? Does he listen? Do you meet relatively regularly? And is he aware of the many arguments around which might involve him having to rethink some of what he does?
Yeah, so I must say I've never been in a meeting where I've ever felt I couldn't speak freely. So from that perspective, at least, I don't think there's an issue. I suspect the problem is so big, the industrial policy problem, and many of these meetings are so large because half of the DTIC is in attendance, that sometimes the meetings are not as efficient as they could be. But no, I think he listens to everyone. He takes his own counsel and makes his own decision. But certainly, I've never felt that anyone has ever been shut down in those sessions.
Yeah. Well, let's start then with trade generally and the two main components of trade. Start with exports. Recent statistics are showing pretty strong trade surpluses in recent months, which is interesting. Is that because mineral prices have been rising globally, or are we just getting better? In October, SARS says we exported goods worth 192 billion rand and imported goods worth only 176. That's pretty good, isn't it? I mean, and it's not the first month that has happened. In order, the biggest export markets are China, Germany. This is in October. China, Germany, the US, Japan, and India. And our imports came from, once again, China at the top, India, the US, Germany, and Oman, of all things. Why Oman? Would that be oil?
I would assume so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would assume so.
So we are still running a trade surplus despite the huge tariffs placed on the country by US President Donald Trump. How have we managed that? What's happening?
Well, a lot of that is just due to precious metal prices being high, particularly gold, which just seems to have gone completely crazy. So there's a significant element of this that has nothing to do with South Africa and has everything to do with the fact that the rest of the world is panicked a bit by the dollar and so seem to be hoarding gold under their beds at the moment. So I think that's a significant part of it. We South Africans have a weird kind of obsession with a trade surplus or deficit, almost to the point where we kind of start to sound like Trump does, as if a surplus is good and a deficit is bad. I think when you have a look at it, much of our surplus, and this is not just a recent phenomenon, is very often caused by high precious metal or mineral prices generally. Mining is still 50% of what we export. So, it's the one sector that government seems to be dead set on breaking into little pieces, but that keeps consistently outperforming all of the others.
It's nothing to be ashamed of, though. Mining is what we do in many ways. We're farmers and miners, aren't we? And to the extent that mining is working, that's great. I mean, I know we're not building any new mines and we're not exploring much or at all for any new deposits. But, when the good times arrive, we can be thankful that we are still able to go down and dig out the ores and the minerals that people want to buy.
Well, no. So on the contrary, I think we should be doing a lot more with mining than we are doing. What we seem to want to do is impose an insane, difficult set of regulations on the mining sector. We've also decided we should beneficiate minerals in a way that I don't entirely understand. But nevertheless, that strategy at present seems to be coming at the cost of the mining sector. So I don't entirely understand the thinking about it when you get past the use of the word beneficiation, which is kind of seems to have a magical quality to it now. But
yeah, and then Donald, if you look at imports, the state over the years now has erected a series of tariffs and duties and other barriers that would make even the old apartheid isolationists blush. Are there any signs we're saving any of our industries, like steel, for instance, with these tariffs and with these duties?
No, not at all. So the problem we have is we're assuming that the reason our manufacturing sector more broadly struggles to compete is just that this whatever the tariff is will kind of fix that inequality. Whereas the reason we struggle to make things is we've got broken infrastructure. We don't have electricity. When we do have electricity, it's very expensive. The ports are broken. The rail is broken. We have municipalities which are pretty much, barring one or two notable exceptions, have almost all collapsed in South Africa. So the reason we're not competitive very often has nothing to do with what other people are doing. Many of our imports are just the importation of electricity that is working consistently and functioning infrastructure and a safe environment to put your investment in. That is what you're effectively importing. So I don't think the path that we're on to kind of raise tariffs at the rate that we are doing is going to fix any of this.
And what happens when you raise this in the Economic Advisory Council? Park Tower sitting there, you're telling him this, that basically by importing Japanese cars or Japanese bridal gowns or whatever they may be, you're importing all the good things in Japan that help make those products possible. What's his answer?
Well, I'd said in one of the very first meetings we ever had that the reason I thought industrial policy conceptually in South Africa would not work is simply because the problems don't sit inside the DTIC. So they sit in Transnet and they sit in Eskom and they sit with policing that is corrupt and incompetent and so on. So whatever you did would at best just kind of touch on the edges of what mattered. Parks Tower doesn't control the Department of Basic Education. The DA does, but they don't seem to have done much to improve, and perhaps it's an unfairly short period. But we still graduate children from high school who are functionally illiterate and innumerate in volume. And so these, to my mind, are far more important problems to deal with than to pick a winning industry, throw your effort behind it, but that industry still can't find strong human capital to employ, still struggles to get its exports out of the country cost effectively because the ports are broken and extremely expensive.
But given all of those constraints, isn't it just reasonable then that he, instead of trying to fix basic education or trying to fix the railway system, as the minister responsible for imports and exports, he's simply going to do what he can do to stop what remains of South African industry being swamped by, say, cheap steel? Or is there, even in his constrained position, is there room for him to be better and more innovative and more competitive? Fight back without punishing the consumers of those imports.
So let's just look at steel for a moment. We've gone completely hog wild with steel. 2 billion rand was given to Mittal, just tariffs on everything that they produce. And the effect of this has not been a thriving steel industry, because the steel industry is not ArcelorMittal. The steel industry starts at an iron ore mine and ends with a guy who fabricates burglar bars or whatever it might be. And the problem is, when we make the raw material expensive for the part of the steel industry that employs the most people, the fabricators, every fabricator becomes less competitive. So the problem I think we have, which is not related to this minister, but really is a South African political problem, is we can't let go of the losers. So our industrial policy has largely been a set of policies to stop the patient dying when it's in intensive care. But this squeezes
this all goes back to the argument, particularly about steel, that it's, in some way sort of strategic. And you've seen what happened to ArcelorMittal. They were given a huge amount of money to keep their integrated plant at Newcastle going. And the state actually was paying the salaries of the entire staff for, month after month, and it's still being closed down. So what lesson does the minister take from that?
Well,
try harder, do more.
Well, I think there are many problems with the Newcastle operation, but part of the problem is we have conflicting policies. So we have a policy which says we need to defend this 100-year-old company. We have to have steel production. Maybe we do, but it's not obvious to me why we do have to have it. but maybe we do. If you buy that, then the support given to the mini mills, the companies who make steel out of scrap metal, is in direct conflict. So much of the problem out of Newcastle is not caused by imports of steel out of China, but instead by extremely cheap steel out of the subsidized mini mills.
Well, they're not
Now,
subsidized. I mean, the price controls on scrap, which is what
well, but it is an
Yeah.
effective subsidy.
Yeah.
My calculation is we transfer from manufacturers to mini mills about 8.5 billion rand a year in value. Azar Jamin calculates it at 6 billion a year, and the DTIC themselves calculated at 4 billion. So even if we call it 4 billion, that's quite a lot of money. And then you add to that the cheap finance out of the IDC. So the IDC's overcapitalized the sector.
The IDC
so-
being, for listeners, the IDC being the Industrial Development Corporation, which is an arm of the Department of Trade and Industry, right?
Yes. So it's
So carry
effectively
on.
it's a state bank, despite
Yeah.
the fact that the state
Yeah.
says we don't have a bank.
Yeah.
And so this state bank has been given friendly finance to these mini mills. And so what you've done is you've attracted a huge amount of capital, cheap capital, into an area that naturally wouldn't attract that much capital. And so the cheap capital and the cheap raw material have seen an overinvestment by the mini mills. And that overinvestment manifests as an overproduction. That overproduction has caused the prices of those long products to collapse. And Newcastle I'm not saying that's the only reason, but it is one of the reasons that Newcastle cannot survive.
And Donald, this, for the benefit of listeners and viewers, the mini mills are a fairly new thing in South Africa, created by the IDC to facilitate the growth of black industrialists, or have I got that wrong? Were there always mini mills here, and they're simply doing what they've always done, or is there a growth industry in black-owned mini mills?
No. So we've had mini mills. If I'm not mistaken, I think SCORE was set up in the 1940s already. So we had mini mills for close to 100 years in South Africa. What is different here is, firstly, the number of mini mills. So they have shot up dramatically. There's a new one opening, Chinese-owned, in Nigel shortly, which will add another 600,000 tons of long steel to a market that's already oversupplied. I don't know what the ownership of these mini mills looks like, so I don't know if they're black-owned or white-owned or whatever the case might be. But what we do know is we're not in a market where our manufacturing sector is generating lots and lots of excess waste, because the manufacturing sector is struggling. And so when your manufacturers are the generators of scrap and your manufacturing is not doing well, then what you're going to end up with is an endless pleading with government to keep finding ways to keep your supply of cheap scrap metal flowing, which is effectively what has happened.
And why does the pleading have such deep purchase? What's the politics of that pleading? Why do the mini mills have so much political clout if it's not a black empowerment thing? Where's their strength come from?
Well, that's a question I can't entirely answer. I find this somewhat bewildering. It's a capital intensive sector, so we're not talking massive amounts of jobs. But the IDC, according to Ibrahim Patel when he was still minister, the IDC's exposure to the mini mills is 14 billion rand. So there's just a straight out capital exposure that is enormous. So it could be an element of how do you protect the book? If you took away the protections, then the book itself becomes unstable.
The IDC book, yeah.
The IDC book. But it could also be that the government has a weird obsession with steel, and this is steel. So, perhaps this is this is part of that strategic manufacturing capacity that we need to have.
Well,
And
you've seen much the same thing happening in the UK recently, where the British government, the Labour government, is falling over itself to keep the last two integrated steel makers going. I mean, it's taken one over, and I think it's paying huge amounts of money or loans to the other survivor. Both, I think, ended up being Chinese-owned, and certainly in the one, the Chinese just walked away from it and said, "We're out of here. You can't make steel profitably in this country."
Yep. So I think the world has become weirdly obsessed with industrial policy, in part, by the way, I think because of China's enormous subsidies and overproduction of lots and lots of products. And so there's a fear that if you don't do something, you're just going to, China will make everything and everyone else would just be a consumer. So it could be there.
So you remember a couple of years back, we had all these master plans, right, when Brian Patel was the Minister of Trade and Industry. Steel was one of them. The other one, although it wasn't necessarily his plan, but he was certainly involved in developing it, was automobiles. How's automobiles doing? I mean, can you now import an EV for less money than you could a year ago? Or is there no progress on that?
No. Don't be silly.
No.
So, I mean, the one kind of defining characteristic of a sector that gets a master plan is usually that the sector then does really poorly afterwards. And that pattern seems to hold for automotive. Look, EVs still attract a high tariff, 25%. So it's expensive to bring EVs in. They're already an expensive vehicle. So I think we're not going to see relief on that in a hurry. Perhaps we will see some relief on things like buses, where there's politically, and I include taxis here, buses and taxis, there may be a solid political reason to make those EVs cheaper. But I think for normal EVs, the incumbent producers are not going to welcome the competition from BYD, etc.
Yeah. It's interesting, that we no longer produce a small half-ton bakkie or van in South Africa now that Nissan stopped making the NP200. Yet I would have thought, and I own an NP200, and I can tell you now, I bought it about 4 years ago, and I could get more for it now than I paid for it because they are so rare, and it's in pretty good condition. They're so rare, but the government won't allow the import of used cars in any form. And you would have thought that, for a government trying to encourage enterprise and the growth of new businesses in the country, that at least they'd look for a way to let people find and own cheap transport.
So there's a trade-off, and all industrial policy favors the producer over the consumer. So that's just the nature of what it is. It's taking value from the consumer and giving it to the producer. And the thinking would be that the producers will then generate enough growth and economic activity to compensate for that. That's clearly not the case in South Africa. Peter, I was in China earlier this year, and I saw something on the roads which really fascinated me, which is kind of a motorbike bakkie combination. So it's a three-wheeler, carries about 200 kilograms that you can put at the back of it. And I thought, that would be amazing for a guy with a small construction company or a little gardening business. These are really cheap and they're not terribly fast or anything, but these sorts of things I think could make quite a big difference. But I don't see that in our future at all.
Yeah. Donald, let's talk about Donald Trump briefly. What has been the Trump effect on our economy so far? Word is that we're actually managing quite nicely, thank you, despite he's punishing 30% tariffs on our exports there. How's that possible? I mean, people have either got to pay 30% more for the things they buy from us, or they're not buying, but the numbers don't say that.
Yes.
We run a trade surplus with the US. We ran one until he came into office. And I think looking at the SARS figures I was talking about just now, we still are. If you look at October, by my inexpert calculation, I have to confess, we exported goods worth 14 billion rand to them. That may well have been, high-priced minerals, but we imported only 11 billion rands worth. I reckon that's pretty decent. When, if at all, do the Trump's tariffs really start to, bite?
Well, we need to look at what it hits. So probably now more than half of our exports are exempted because they're minerals. So they just get taken out of the equation and we must forget about them. If we look at the rest of it, we then get to cars, but that is really a Mercedes-Benz issue. So it's affecting one company. I'm not suggesting it's not a problem for them, but it's not the automotive industry. It's one company and their suppliers into that company. From there, and the automotive is the same duty for everyone. That is not one of these 30% duties. This is a 25% for the whole world. So the effect of that has not been that huge. When we get to the products where the 30% begins to bite, we look at agricultural goods. So think of citrus, but most citrus was recently exempted. Table grapes, I think the odds of that being exempted are probably fairly good. And for most of these, particularly citrus, you're only going to see the effect in the course of the next year with the next season, because this season's product was already sold. Remember, it's a winter crop. So most of that was just unaffected. When we get to things like wine, yes, it's an issue, but it's a relatively small part of the basket. So, our trade with the US is really trade in precious metals, which means it is trade in product that is not affected by the 30%. And a relatively small portion of our trade is affected, which is why I think President Ramaphosa has been more relaxed about this than he would have been if he was in Mexico or something, which is far more directly impacted.
Yeah. You used to have a really nice calculation that you made about AGOA. So as the African Opportunity and Growth Act allows South Africa and other African countries up until now, up until recently, to export into the States and get a nice tax break on those imports. And I remember asking you once how big the tax break was. It was a small number.
Yes.
Just remind us what it was quickly,
So
and then I'll finish my...
It's
about
a little
$2 billion?
It's about 2 billion rand a year.
Okay. But that was... So losing AGOA means you lose that benefit. I mean, it is a lot of money if you're you or me, but I mean, in terms of country economics, it's not the end of the world. And I was just wondering, does it really matter if we're out of AGOA? If that's all the benefit is? No. Okay. Yeah. No. I figured that. And
AGOA was always a political tool of the US. AGOA was never about Africa. And so the US never gave anything under AGOA that was material. I'm not saying the value was zero, but by our calculation, the average benefit under AGOA came in at about 3.5%.
Yeah. Okay, let's move along then. So, while our big export markets like the US, China, may be far away, the government here has put a lot of effort, particularly President Ramaphosa, into creating a really big, giant internal African market, right, with the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is now, the nascent African rival to the EU and the South American internal market. How's that going? Is it up and running for a start? Is the rest of continental Africa signed up, and can we measure ACTFA's size and importance?
Yes. So the numbers don't show much at all, but let me tell you, conceptually, I think it's a good idea. It's a good idea because African countries need to have a reason to kind of talk to each other about trade, whereas historically they haven't. So I think from that perspective, it's good. It's gotten a focus onto the big African problems like infrastructure, which is a big issue. The agreement, however, is not really making a difference in our lives, in part because even the agreement we've had for ages, the SADC agreement, is incredibly poorly utilized. So, our trade with Africa can be defined as mostly we export to the other customs union countries, which is Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia. We do a little bit more to outside of there to mainly Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique. Although most of the trade through Mozambique, which you see the president got very excited about, is in fact through Mozambique to use their port because our own ports are a wreck. So we and then that's it. So the rest of Africa is a rounding error in our lives, and that is not going to change in a hurry. So we've got to understand that Africa looks a very particular way. It's an extremely poor continent. We're fighting up against producers in China, India, etc., which tend to just be more competitive than we are. And so the idea that this duty preference would suddenly unlock these markets it's important, but it's important in the long term. In the short term, we're still not a competitive manufacturer of almost anything. And so, the rest of Africa, we're suddenly not going to become good because we call the target market Ghana or Nigeria. I don't see it.
Yeah. Well, just to come back to the Southern African Customs Union, SACU, that's, as you say, Botswana, Eswatini, Swaziland, Lesotho, and Namibia.
Yes.
The big thing there for us, if I remember correctly, was textiles. There was a textile master plan as well, wasn't there?
Yes.
With all sorts of rules put in place to protect South African textile companies. And you produced a report recently, which I'm going to just read from if I can quickly find it, which was very instructive. You were saying that, South Africa's always tilted the deck in its own favor, but the tilting was never overt until the arrival of the various master plans, with retail, clothing, textile, footwear, and leatherware being the most pernicious. The RCTFL master plan, signed in November 2019, deliberately targets clothing manufacturers in the other SACU states, Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia, by way of a very complicated rebate. And this is, I want to just read this to people because I don't think enough people know. Clothing manufacturers can import textiles, this is South Africans, I presume, to make clothing and not pay the duty of 22.5% if they agree to the following. 1, be a member of the bargaining council. 2, commit to buying a minimum volume from local textile producers. 3, not to sell the clothing they make outside the country of they manufacture in. And 4, only to sell to clothing retailers who've signed the master plan. And as you said in your report, there are only 7 of those. How that can't possibly be working. Yet what I hear is that some of the companies involved have done quite well out of it.
Yes.
Foschini being one of them.
So, Foschini has just taken the bull by the horns, and they've acquired quite a lot of manufacturing businesses. This is not a secret. But this is not a good situation. You've got the Competition Commission on the one hand, who's saying we want to avoid a situation where we create these highly concentrated markets. And then you have a master plan, which
does exactly that. Yeah,
absolutely. So when you've got your small private retail store in Soweto, wherever you may be, you're immediately at a disadvantage to any of the big signatories of the master plan. Surely that can't be a good idea, but it is written into the text of the agreement.
How do you fix that? What do you do? Do we throw away the master plans? Is there another plan? Is it better? It used to be in the Thatcherite days. The people used to say, well, the best industrial policy is not to have one at all.
Yeah. So there are a couple of things out of the master plan that I thought were a good idea, and probably the most valuable of all was that people spoke to each other. The problem is that speaking happened in secret, and that creates an environment where lobbying is materially rewarded. So I think if we're going to have a master plan, and I'm not sold on the idea that we should, but if we are going to have it, it can't be a select group of people that get special access and get to argue their position at the cost of everyone else in the sector. And that is the effect of what most of our master plans have done. They've been deliberately exclusionary to parts of the sector, and I think that is an unhealthy situation.
Yeah. Does Minister Parks Tau show any inclination to scrapping these master plans, or are you just going to live with them?
I think politically the cost of scrapping them is just
would be
too
quite high.
It's easier to ignore them.
Yeah. You've also done a big report for the same department, Trade, Industry and Competition, on the absolutely mind-boggling number of funds and interventions that the government has erected to encourage the growth of black industrialists or black business. You were asked to do this report by the department, and your point seemed to be, when I read it, that there was more than enough money on the table, so much so that the government departments and dedicated funds, and there must be 100 of them, we're having great difficulty spending or investing at all. Is it working, or is it not working? Can we do it better? What's the problem?
So I think there are a couple of things which are factually correct. The one is that small business struggles to access finance, but that is not because the finance is not there. We uncovered such a bewildering array of funds, and so the exact scale of how much is out there is, firstly, it's going to be bigger than what is in the report, because we did that report in a very short amount of time. So
what do you give us a number that you arrived at, and we'll assume that it's a small version of what the real truth is.
Well, we tracked it. Let me give you some examples here. So we tracked the Black Industrialist Program. It's hard to get to a precise number, but that program, depending what you've read, has dispersed either 35 billion or 55 billion. They're different sources. We went with the most conservative in there. Now, we know where the money went to, because Minister Patel published a glossy document with photographs of black people in lab coats, etc. And they showed where all the money went to. What we haven't got a sense of is what that money accomplished. So we know that the money was dispersed, but we don't know what the return on that is. And by return, I don't mean it in the way that a bank or a private equity fund would think about it.
Yeah. Are the companies working? Yeah.
Well, yes. And importantly, are they putting back into the economy more than they've taken out by way of the grants that they received? And there are a ton of versions of this. So the concern that I've had, which the minister is very aware of, is why are we going to be creating, for example, another transformation fund? Which I understand, depending who you talk to, that it'll be voluntary, but then I don't see how anyone is going to voluntarily put 20 billion a year into that fund. And if it's not voluntary, then why are we doing it when all of these other funds already exist? So I guess my only issue is that if we correctly define the problem and we say SMEs don't have access to enough capital, black businesses are starved of capital, then what are we doing on the other side? So why is the NEF, for example, sitting with billions on its balance sheet undistributed? If
this is the National Empowerment Fund, rather than another vehicle. Yeah.
And we have all of these transformation funds at Department of Agriculture, which is ironically run by the DA, who says that they're not in favor of all of these. But the Department of Agriculture has got so many transformation funds. So, you've got a soybean transformation fund, etc. So what is happening with all of these funds? What I find confusing is why that analysis has not happened before we put more money in. And I'm hoping this report at least sparks that off as an important area before more money is extracted.
Well, the minister has said he's going to review BEE to the extent that Black Industrialist Program and all these other programs are part of the sort of BEE environment, the transformation environment. You would have thought that he would look at everything, right? I mean, were you able, when you were looking at these funds, let's say the Department of Small Business, the Department of Small Business has at least 20 funds that I could count in your report. And I was just wondering, is each fund then managed by a different person or group of people? Do they have their own boards? How do you access? The report is too much for me to access while I'm talking to you. But I mean, there's some very, very niche funding there, and it's not small money either. Presumably, to get that money, you've got to know who to talk to. And, were you able to gauge how hard it was for people to access? You're saying they're not accessing the funds. Is that because it's hard, or is it just very political?
So we could track down the existence of some of the funds, but we were unable to figure out how people get access to the money. So you expect it to be relatively easy to find that out. But for the most part, it isn't. So I have no idea how people access most of those. To the question of the Department of Small Business, this is one of the more ridiculous departments we have in government. And in my view, it should simply not exist. It should be a part of the DTIC. It needs to disappear. And I mean, this is evidenced by their latest business licensing bill that they've published, which to my mind is completely insane. So, why do we have this department? I don't know what they do with that money other than publish glossy brochures.
Presumably it's to create, political, it's to pay for political support. You create another minister, make them a member of the African National Congress National Executive Committee, and they're yours while they're in office, I presume. I mean, this is why we have one of the largest cabinets in the world. It's distressing.
Create a department that can do no harm. The problem here is that this department has consistently put out some of the worst policies. I mean, the business licensing bill is one of them. The small business department's master plan is equally terrible, with its 1,000 identified sectors for localization.
Yeah. Well, that's where I got the wedding gowns I mentioned just now, because I remember that was very high up on their list. We should only allow the sale in South Africa of locally made wedding gowns. I mean, I don't know. I found it amusing at the time, but you're right. There were 1,000 different ideas, not one of which, well, I presumably, like a lot of government reports, not only in this country but everywhere else, they are produced because somebody, for some reason, wants them to, and immediately forgotten. Nobody remembers the small business department localization product list, I'm sure. But Donald, is there a more simple way of getting all this right? I mean, it's not unreasonable to want to see more Black South Africans with skin in the game, in industry and in manufacturing, in the economy. The question is, are subsidies and import barriers and export barriers the way to do it? The scrap metal that you were talking about just now is a really good example of the extent to which the ANC has had to distort markets in order to facilitate transformation. Eventually, there's a price to pay, surely, and I'm sure you've thought about the price. I mean, what might it look like? It's not just in scrap metal, it's in a lot of parts of our economy where markets have been throttled or changed or had their hands tied behind their backs in order to facilitate transformation. And there has to be a consequence.
Well, the scrap metal thing is probably the most bewildering for me, because when you see a waste picker, even in Stellenbosch, it's funny how you don't see many white Afrikaans people collecting scrap. So when you devalue the price of that scrap, you're taking it out of the pockets of black people. So it's not a victimless crime. The money that gets transferred to these mini mills, in part at least, comes out of the pockets of the people that are collecting. So, if you had a concern about those people, then making them poorer is probably not a great way to go about doing it. And I'm not suggesting that it's deliberate, but it is the effect of all of this. You'd find few people more enthusiastic about the idea that black people need to do better in South Africa. It's just not clear to me that all of these interventions are getting there. What we have is a small group of people who've done incredibly well. There's a middle class, which is largely employed by government, and many of them unemployable in the private sector. Now, this is not to say we shouldn't do more to get more black businesses doing well. My concern is just what we've done has not gotten us there. So, if we cared about the success of black people, then we would really care about the quality of their education. But it is evident from the last 30 years that the government's primary concern has been teacher unions rather than students. And in that environment, what we've ended up with are very powerful teacher unions and illiterate kids that, half of them don't even finish high school. So if we're going to create a competitive economy and we're going to raise the levels of productivity with black people, which is an absolute prerequisite for them to do well, then we have to surely address the basics. I mean, we still have kids drowning in pit latrines. It is astonishing to me.
Yeah. Donald, you're the trade expert, yeah? I've often thought, because it's all right to criticize what the government does, but I mean, it's really hard to think of solutions to these things. But I've often thought, if we were to say, right, no product can be exported from South Africa unless it's been beneficiated or processed in some way. That's minerals, food, okay, not fruit and that, but clothing, even scrap, which can be cut and shaped or melted. And, if you would just make that a basic rule, we could then, avoid all export taxes. In return, we drop almost all import duties, provided, they're fairly priced and not just dumped here and sold for less than they cost to produce. How would that work? I mean, what would a very simple approach to all of this look like? Beneficiate everything before you export it, and you don't pay tax. And import what you like, can't be dumped. And so we'll have safeguard duties or whatever they're called, which are, in place all around the world.
So we do need to focus on exports. Exports are the only time if a sector is competitive or not. If you can export, then clearly outside of South Africa, someone values your goods enough to buy it from you. I don't think you can compel beneficiation because it's at the beneficiation stage that the rocks we dig out of the ground lose all of their value. It's when we try to manufacture things. My personal view is we have to fix the reasons why we struggle to make things. So,
but Donald, if I can just interrupt you, I'm not saying make something, but beneficiation. You beneficiate coal by burning it. You can beneficiate platinum by turning it into pellets or briquettes or whatever. You don't have to make a moving part or a cylinder head or whatever it might be. Just add some value. Add some value. Even your scrap metal, you can cut a piece of plate or put a hole in it or make it square or round or whatever it might be. And they do that in the UK. They have a big scrap merchants industry in the UK. We don't have merchants in this country. We just have dealers. But it's possible to add value to the things that we do as a matter of course, and then don't we engender something good in the country if we were to try?
Well, but what if we can't? So what happens to all of those products that could have been exported where after we've put the hole in it, or there are not enough people that want to put a hole in it? Like, what happens to that product? I mean, all that's going to happen is we're going to have a domestic market awash with scrap that doesn't have a hole in it.
Yeah. Or does have a hole in it, yeah.
It just
No,
no, I don't think
no,
that
I
will
get
work.
you. Yeah, okay. But I mean, I think, I don't think it's unreasonable to want some processing to be involved. You will have seen, and this is my last question really, the South African ferrochrome smelters, right? So this is the Mackay and Glencore. They've just we're recording this on Monday. This morning they reached a deal with Eskom for an electricity price for their smelters, almost half of what they've been paying. And the way they're going to do this is very briefly, the ferrochrome smelters, one of which is Glencore, are going to supply coal through an IPP that they'll create, an independent power producer that they'll create, which will sell Eskom coal, which will then be converted into electricity at cost to the coal miners, and at a very small profit to Eskom. What is interesting about it is that it becomes an unsubsidized and doesn't have to be regulated by NERSA, but it becomes a really functional way, an innovative way through a difficult problem. We've lost pretty much 90% of our chrome smelting capacity in this country. There are 4 furnaces still working, and this deal will save those, and it will allow about another 20 furnaces to come back online if the deal goes ahead at the end of February, as has been agreed. And yeah, I mean, it just shows you what you can do, I suppose, if you try hard enough and involve the private sector.
We obviously don't want to see the smelters disappear. So I'm happy to hear about what has happened with ferrochrome. But the reason we ended up in this problem is because of Eskom. This is a far more elegant solution than what was being proposed, like an export duty on the chrome ore, for example, which was never going to fly. Whereas this is a little less of a problem. We'd have to see how China's uptake of this ferrochrome is going to look, because bear in mind, when our ferrochrome sector collapsed because of Eskom, it's not as if that capacity disappeared. That capacity is now sitting in China.
Yeah.
So we still have to fight to get that back. We'll have to see how that goes.
Yeah, look, Mackay is now a Chinese controlled company, as far as I know. The other thing, of course, if we manage to turn this economy around, right, and get all this industry back, you'd have to ask the question of whether Eskom would have enough electricity to power it all. One of the reasons the lights are on now may have something to do with the other fact that the economy is, in a bit of a dump, not firing on all cylinders.
I was talking to an economist just a few weeks ago, and she made the observation that we've gotten rid of load shedding for as long as our GDP growth sits below 2%. And when we breach the 2% level, we're likely to be back in load shedding. So of course, there's a build out that is happening. President Ramaphosa did an amazing thing when he lifted the cap on self-generation and so on. But the fact is, we have enough electricity for an economy that is not growing.
Yeah. Donald, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a great holiday. And thank you also to the folk who follow this podcast. I'm enormously grateful. And I hope you all have a safe and peaceful holiday. And I hope to be able to welcome you all back in the new year. So until 2026, bye-bye.